So, hi, my name is Sarah, and I'm from the Center for Social Change, and we have Lorinda with us from Grants, Inc. I'm going to share my screen real quick and tell you guys a bit about this center in case you haven't heard of us. So this is where we are at Grant Writing in a Pandemic. We're all wanting to know how to adjust our grant writing during this time, and happy to have Lorinda with us. The Center for Social Change is a nonprofit co-working space for nonprofits and other change makers in the community. And pre-COVID, we all got together often for different events. Oh, sorry, having issues. Here we go. So post-COVID, this is what we're doing now, right? We're still having these events, but we're all online. We do offer some types of memberships. In general, we have people come into the office, like I said, but right now you can be an ally member and still have access to a lot of these courses that we offer and other benefits. We also offer a couple different types of fiscal sponsorship. This is a lot of text, but you can reach out to Luli at the Center for Social Change to learn more. And if you have any questions about becoming fiscally sponsored, it's a great way to do this work in the community, but maybe not have your own nonprofit. We also offer bookkeeping help, help with your payroll, grant management, and all of these things. Again, you can contact Luli at forsocialchange.org. And that's actually our website too. So I'm going to let Lorinda introduce herself and take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. Can everybody hear me okay? Hear me good? Awesome. So excited to be here today. Thanks everybody for attending. If you're comfortable, I would love it if you could take off your camera or turn on your camera so I can see you. I'm going to be asking some questions, and I want to definitely keep us as engaged as possible, especially because we are in person. So if that is a possibility, please turn your cameras on so I can see your beautiful faces. If not, it's okay. I may call on you though if you don't. But today we are going to discuss grant writing in a pandemic. So there's many names here that I don't recognize. So to give you a very brief introduction of myself, my name is Lorinda Gonzalez. Thanks for turning on the camera. Lorinda Gonzalez, I'm the Director of Grants and Training at a firm called Grants, Inc. I've been doing grant writing myself for about 10 years, and together we've brought in about $15 million of funding for the community. We are located in Miami, but we service organizations throughout the United States and also in Latin America and a couple other countries. So we've done a lot of really good work. We have a team right now, a development team of 5 people. So we have research. We're very focused on research and grant funding opportunities, also doing the budgeting and the finance side of things and the actual grant writing. So all that to say, education really and training is my passion personally. It's what I like to do the most. And I hope that today we can, share some information with you on what this looks like, what the landscape is of grants and grant funding now that we're in this pandemic situation, because things have changed drastically. Since we have a nice small group, if you do have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask me the question. If not, you can always, pop it into the chat room, and at the end of the presentation, we'll have time to go through it. But we are a small group, so if you want to, interrupt and ask me a question, feel free. I'm happy to answer absolutely anything that may come to mind. No question is a bad question. So let's get started. Open you up. I have a new screen. Hold on one second. I have a new double screen that I'm using for the first time. So my apologies if it takes me a second to figure out how to use this technology. Let's share screen here. Okay, here we go. No, not that one. Apparently I have 2 desktops now. Okay, are you guys seeing the presentation?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. Alrighty. Okay, we see it? Great. So grant writing in a pandemic. So the purpose of today's workshop is going to discuss ways that the whole funding landscape has shifted in reaction to COVID. Like every other industry, Practically in the world, things have shifted. And when it comes to grant funding in general, things are very different now than they were a year ago. So we're going to discuss what that looks like a little bit. We're also going to chat a little bit about the impact of these changes on nonprofit organizations and other social enterprises, because the reality is the organizations that are resilient and that are going to exist moving forward have to completely change the way that they're focusing on programs. So we're going to go through what that looks like. And then finally, we're going to end with ways that nonprofits can become more resilient, things that you can do today to get off the ground, and also give you some examples of nonprofits that have shifted and changed the way they're doing things in order to be resilient in this new landscape that we have. So has COVID affected grant funding? The answer is yes, it has quite a bit. So I like this quote, change is coming whether you like it or not. The fact is that this entire, and as we know, every industry has been affected, but when it comes specifically to grants and funding sources and the nonprofit sector, there has been drastic changes that nobody expected. And we're gonna go through what that looks like. So top level, some of the things that have changed is funders are changing their initiatives. So an initiative, a funder initiative is really what they're funding and why they're funding, right? So the what and the why have completely shifted. The government is creating new programs every day. The CARES Act that was recently released, there was about $150 million of brand new grant funds that were distributed specifically related to COVID, in reaction to COVID. So we're gonna go through that a little bit. Also, there's much more of a higher importance placed on the online environment, which we all know, because I mean, look where we are right now. Instead of being in a classroom, we're actually here together online. So even from the funding perspective, we're seeing a big increase on the online environment, which we're going to go through a little bit. And then the whole idea previously, before all of this happened, and this is something that I've been talking about for many years, because while I service nonprofit organizations, I come from a for-profit background, and I like to bring a lot of those concepts into the nonprofit sector, because that's what creates a resilient and a sustainable nonprofit that continues to grow and continues to serve people. And one of these things that I've been harping on for years and is now becoming very apparent is that there's been this crisis approach to grant funding, and that organizations will seek grant fundings when they're ready to close their doors, when programs don't have enough funding to keep going. That's when they tend to seek out grant writers and grant funding. But that is completely obsolete. At this point in time, you know, I think this is one of the good things that's come out of this, is that there needs to be a different approach to seeking out funding and being a sustainable organization. So instead of just applying for a grant, you know, right when you have, you know, all your money's run out and you need it in order to survive, now we're having to embrace a little bit of a different concept, which has to do more with the sustainability and the growth of a nonprofit and how to acquire funding for the long term, right? And also funding for crises and situations like this. So we'll go through a little bit of that today, and then we have another workshop coming up in like a month that will go through the strategy a little bit more, but I wanted to at least touch base on that. That whole crisis approach to grant funding is obsolete. So let's discuss a little bit about the funders. So the initiatives that funders have changed. So just so that a little bit of a refresher, there are three primary funders that are providing grant funds. We have our government, which is your federal, your state, and your local municipalities. Then you have your foundation funders, which are your family foundations, like for instance, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, right? Or the Miami Foundation, which is hyper-focused on Miami-Dade County. So you have your government, your foundations, and then you have your corporate grants. Your corporate grants are going to come from all your major corporations. Any large corporation in the United States is going to have some kind of funding or foundation in place in order to provide grant funds to nonprofits. So thinking Coca-Cola, thinking HP, any major company you can think of, just look around, you know, within your workspace right now, and you can see, think about all the name brands of items that you may have around you. Guarantee that 95 if not 100% of them have some kind of funding that they're providing. So these initiatives that each one of these organizations have, these entities have, are changing and shifting. So, and the reason that they're changing and shifting, it has to do with creating a balance once again in the world, because we've been all completely thrown off by this on a global level. So the reason that they're changing the initiatives, and what I mean by that is, for instance, prior to COVID, they may have had an initiative to fund education, or they may have had an initiative to fund after school programs. Now things are shifting and changing. And again, at all levels, and this is a global movement. So this isn't even something that's just happening in the US. So the reason that they're shifting and changing again is because they're trying to create balance, which is something we're all really working on. So this is a really cool infographic that I created. I was trying to bring into play how the change has happened. So when it comes to COVID-19, specifically the funding after, there's three parts to it. The initial funding changes that we saw had to do with crisis relief. Then it had to do with emerging needs. And then thirdly is traditional initiatives. So we're going to go through each one of these circles together, and I'm going to explain what each one means. And what's interesting is that you're going to see that while all these changes have happened, since we all know there's no definitive end to the COVID situation. We don't know when it's going to end, and are things ever going to go back to how they were? Probably not. And that's directly affecting the funding sources. So feel free to take a picture of this. I can also provide you a copy if you would like, but let's go through this a little bit. So we're going to start with crisis relief. So originally, when this first happened, funders started to focus on reacting to the needs, the ever-changing needs of society, right? The pandemic hit, and we found that many corporations all over the United States and globally, also these foundations, they all decided to react to it quickly and started providing immediate needs. Immediate needs included hand sanitizer, which I just saw is misspelled, but providing masks, providing hand sanitizer, PPE to medical staff, etc. So what they did was their first movement was to respond to crisis. So the second thing that they did was there was a rapid disbursement of supplies, of human power, and of money, right? And this was because we were in this situation. So much was changing. So many people were getting sick and unfortunately passing away. So what we saw was that the first phase of this shift and change was, again, that crisis relief. It was focused on temporary relief, however. So the first funding that started to come out and started to change was based on temporary relief. So really meeting the needs at the moment, not on a long-term basis. Again, it was not focused on long-term sustainability. It was focused specifically on crisis management. So we had a crisis, our hospitals didn't have enough materials, people were losing their jobs, etc. So they were really focused on this crisis management concept, and it was largely unplanned. And that's the other thing to think about, because for instance, we had clients that were actively applying for grants, because we really focused on applying to grants all year long. And then when COVID hit, a lot of the funders said, listen, we're not taking any applications for any long-term programs. We're only funding crisis. So this was like the first phase of what happened. And it was largely unplanned. And again, it was crisis management. And if you've studied or read through crisis management, that really is how do we react to this, major circumstances happening in the moment. And that's really what funders did in the beginning, was they said, okay, let's stop everything that we're doing and let's focus on this crisis situation. And it was with a good intention, right? So the intention of funders, and again, we're talking about government, we're talking about corporate, we're talking about foundation. The purpose of this was to provide temporary, immediate, necessary relief in the moment. It was with a good intention. Did not take into consideration the long-term effect of this, because again, this is something that nobody really planned for. So it was made with good intentions to do that, have that crisis relief. So then the next step, let me just take a sip of coffee real quick, are the emerging needs. And this is kind of where we are now. We're between emerging needs and the next slide we're going to go through. But what's happening in the funding landscape is that the emerging needs started to focus funding on new unplanned needs as they became known. And what I mean by this is, for example, we know that here in Miami-Dade, and I'm sure many other places, the restaurant industry has taken a huge toll, a huge hit, right? Because of all the restaurants that had to be closed, because of the different capacity requirements, 50%, 75% and all that. So a lot of people have unfortunately lost their jobs. That's something that nobody planned for, right? Nobody said, okay, what are we gonna do in this situation? And, looking at it from the for-profit perspective, economically, that's been really difficult for a lot of small businesses, right? So the emerging needs have to do with the second shift or the second wave of funding changes that we're seeing. So instead of just focusing on the crisis in the moment, now we're seeing that there's new needs, new problems that society has. And remember, nonprofit organizations, social causes, organizations that focus on charities and on the public, they're there to meet the needs, the ever-changing needs of the people, the animals, the environment, whatever it may be. But that's why nonprofits exist, right? So what's interesting about this entire COVID situation is that all of these concepts and ideas related to what does the world need, how can we better our world, are completely changed, right? Because of the pandemic, because it was a global issue. So again, the second wave that we call emergent needs started focusing on funding new unplanned needs. So an example is like emergency community needs related to government shutdown, social distancing, etc., like I mentioned before. So because of the government shutdowns, because of social distancing, because of the increased rates of COVID infections and such, these new problems have been created in society that we didn't know would happen. For example, rental assistance to individuals who previously were employed in the restaurant industry. There have been new grants that have come out specifically to help individuals in those situations so that they could pay their electric bill or that they could pay their rent, because previously they were employed, but because of these shutdowns, now they no longer have jobs. So these are emerging needs and things that we're going to see that are going to continue, but that are somewhat unpredictable. And that's what makes this kind of difficult, is that it's unpredictable changes. So secondary funding that was more unexpected than crisis relief changes almost on a daily basis. So this emerging needs, again, has to do with like the second shift or the second wave of funding initiatives and funding changes in this whole grant sector. And it's really focused on, it's unexpected, right? Unexpected relief. So we didn't know that people, and again, I use the restaurant industry because I think it's something that people can resonate with. We didn't know that so many people were going to lose their jobs, right? We had no idea that this was going to happen and that it was going to last so long. I remember in the beginning when this was going on, we're all thinking maybe a month or whatever. And this has been almost a year that things are still not 100% back to normal. So again, this emerging needs is funding is in alignment with these changes as they go on. So as we see that different larger groups of people and individuals have new needs related to the changes that are affected by COVID, then we're seeing funding shifting that way. So this is kind of where we still are, is going to be in this section. And it's an attempt to provide support for new and more ongoing needs. So
Miranda, I think I had a question in the side too.
Yes, perfect. Let's see. Chat. Would a 501c3 be included under emerging needs? Yes. Yes. So emerging needs really has to do with the funding. It's a great question, Noreen. Thank you for that. It really has to do with what the new needs are as far as the community and as far as society, because nonprofit organizations, those are 501c3s, those are going to be any kind of social cause. So any organizational structure that is meant or put into place to assist the community in one way or another, whether it's an after-school program, an environmental program, an animal rescue program, ocean relief, all those things are community needs, right? They're meant to improve our world in one way or another. And what we're finding is that the funders previously may have said, okay, we're going to focus on ocean relief, or we're going to focus on animal relief. And then this happened, and so they've changed their focuses. So before, originally, it was like, okay, let's meet the needs of people in this crisis situation. And now they're starting to communicate and develop ideas relating to emerging needs, new needs that society has. And the ones that are servicing the people who have these needs are going to be your 501c3s and are going to be your social causes. So those are the businesses or the organizations in place that are there to serve these needs. So I hope that explains it a little bit. And then middle of the road between temporary immediate needs and long-term community issues. So this whole, and I'm going to go back a little bit to the Venn diagram so we can kind of see how this plays out. Let's go back. Okay, so we have our crisis relief, right? So as soon as COVID happened, all the funding went into crisis relief. Now we're seeing a little bit more into these emerging needs because it's very difficult for foundations, for instance, for funders to predict what these new needs are, right? So this is where we are right now, is in this emerging needs section. Okay, we got another question. I love it. What about if I want to develop a grant for civic and social engagement? Yes, that is definitely something that you could find funding for. And we're going to go through a little bit more of the slides later. And what you'll have to do, though, is kind of restructure how you're explaining why you need that funding. So there's a couple of slides about it. Remind me, Noreen, if I don't come back to this question, remind me again later in the presentation. But what you're going to see is that there's going to be, in order to get any kind of funding for any program, there's a different way of articulating things. So we're gonna get to that. Excellent questions. So let's go through this. Does anybody have any questions? I'm gonna close this out for a second regarding emerging needs. Any thoughts that come to mind? Feel free to unmute yourself. No? Quiet group? Okay, that's okay. If you have questions, feel free to yell. I can hear you. Okay, so let's go back. So again, so now we've shifted from crisis management to these emerging needs. Now we're gonna think about traditional initiatives. So traditional initiatives, what I mean by that, so that we're on the same page, is what were the funders funding last year? What were they funding the year before? You know, you may have, let's say, let me think of the Miami Foundation is not a good idea because they fund many different things. But let's say you have the Applebee's Foundation, right? We'll just use them as an example. And they have previously, for the past 20 years, funded after-school education programs. Well, now, because of COVID, even though for 20 years, nonprofits have depended on them for after-school program funding, it is very likely that they're no longer funding that now. This is the thing when it comes to grants that a lot of organizations don't understand or don't really, haven't really thought through, is that you could have a funder that has funded you every single year for 20 years, and year 21, they're no longer funding what you do. That happens all the time. It actually happens usually within 1 or 2 or 3 years. But now, especially with COVID, we're finding that nonprofits that we've worked with that have had funders for many years, they no longer have those funders. Why? Because they have shifted and changed the initiatives, the focal points that they have, the issues in the community that they previously wanted to support. They're not supporting that anymore. And the reason being is because of the pandemic, because this has shifted the way society in general is seeing what the community, what the world actually needs, right? So the idea of traditional initiatives really focuses on the long-term needs in a community. And funders very much are focusing, aside from the crisis management, right? And aside from emerging needs, what they're gonna go back to, what's gonna end up happening is that they are gonna focus on long-term needs in a community. They're not created in a way to be sustainable or to continue to fund for crisis management. They may be able to do that for like a year or 2 or less or whatever, but that's not their main goal, right? Because they themselves are nonprofits and they themselves have strategic plans and all these things in place, and all the funding that they give has to be given to the community. They have certain requirements related to that, but the money that they're funding eventually is going to go to long-term needs that are in the community, right? So what we've seen is that the long-term needs that our community has changed drastically as the pandemic has led to emerging needs that they didn't exist before, right? So many funders have abandoned past initiatives to attempt to meet the needs of today. So like I mentioned before, you may have Applebee's Foundation, I'm just using them as an example. Let's say they funded after school programs for 20 years. They're not funding that anymore because that's not what's needed. Maybe instead what's needed is improved technology for students to study from home, right? Maybe there's something similar that they need to fund, but they're not funding what they used to. So it is an extremely difficult time to predict to predict what the funding is going to be, because the reality is that funders themselves don't even know what they're going to do. And it's really interesting if you come from a strategic perspective. And again, this is kind of bringing the for-profit thought process into this, but even for-profit organizations, it's almost impossible to predict what's going to happen in the next 3 or 6 months. Before we had data and statistics and all kinds of investigative studies and such, you could pretty much predict how a business was going to do. But now with COVID, we have no idea. And that's the same thing for the foundations and for the funders. They really don't know what's going to happen either, but they are going to start seeking out long-term community needs to fund. Do you have to be a nonprofit to receive funding? So no, I would say about 95% of grant funding is for nonprofit organizations that have their 501c3 status, which is a document you would get from the IRS. It's an application you have to submit, but there is still a good amount of funding for profits. And we are seeing now that the federal government specifically is funding some for-profits. So you don't necessarily have to be a nonprofit, but definitely most of the funding is going to be there. Yep, more than welcome. So now that we discussed a little bit of that shift, right, how the funding has changed from funding long-term programs to now first funding crisis situation, then focusing on emerging needs and new things that are coming up. And hopefully we're going to see soon that it will go back to funding long-term initiatives that are different. Let's see how this affects nonprofits, right? So what does this mean for nonprofits? So fundamentally, nonprofits must understand that their purpose is to resolve community issues. That is why a nonprofit organization exists. Nonprofits and social entrepreneurs are the change makers. They're the ones that are put into this world to make positive changes for the community, right? That is why they exist. So coming from that understanding, right? The presence of the pandemic has shifted society's view of what is and what is not important. Back in, before the pandemic, it may have been important to fund a program, let's say an in-school program, right, for kids. Maybe now that's not quite as important anymore because things have changed, right? I think we have a question. And can you get a fiscal sponsor and essentially be under the umbrella of their nonprofit and see nonprofit? Yes, you can. And
I was responding to her as well as letting her know.
Oh, got you. Sorry. I was like, oh yeah, you can. Okay, cool. My bad. So yeah, so the presence of the pandemic shifted society's view on what is and what isn't important, right? And funders are forced now to reevaluate their funding opportunities to ensure most prevalent community needs are being served. So if a funder, let's say a local funder in a local town previously funded, in-school sports programs, right? But now they're seeing that there's a need to provide meals to children because now they don't have access to healthy food. They may very well reevaluate their funding resources, stop funding the sports programs in order to now fund an emerging need, right? So we're seeing a lot of these shifts and changes in the funders world. So nonprofits must also, and when I say nonprofits, I mean nonprofits, social entrepreneurs, anybody in this space needs to take this into consideration in order to be more resilient, right? So we have to understand that the purpose of a nonprofit is to meet the needs of the community. The purpose of foundations and different funders is also to do the same thing. So because we've had a global pandemic, it's changed everything. That just automatically means that everything's changed, right? The community, the world's needs are different, and we really have to acknowledge that. What if you're still developing the concept and outline and you are not a registered organization? Can you go to the center and have them? So that's a really good question. We can, I'm very familiar with the fiscal sponsorship program. So if you'd like, feel free to keep putting in your questions, and at the end, we can go through how that works. Will that work out? Okay, I think so. Awesome, good questions. So reevaluating your programs. So now if you are a nonprofit organization, if you have a community cause that you're working on, now is the absolute best time to start reevaluating your program. So these are a couple of questions that you can ask yourself, right? Number one, how has COVID affected the population we serve, right? And I'm gonna open it up to questions. So, because I'm calling everybody out a little bit so we can chat. How is it that COVID, who do you serve? Or what nonprofit do you have, or what project are you passionate about, and how has COVID changed it? So feel free to unmute yourselves. If not, I'll call on you.
Okay, I'll go.
Thank you.
My nonprofit is called the Challenge to Change, and it services returning citizens. Okay. It's been a challenge with COVID because a lot of them are not able to come into the office anymore. They don't have jobs anymore. And we're trying to make sure that they receive everything that they're supposed to in terms of making sure that they're registered to vote and they have enough funding for their rent and everything. So it's been a challenge.
Right, there you go. Thank you so much for sharing. Perfect example, right? So now they can't come into the office, so now you have to service them virtually. But they have emerging needs, like you mentioned, right? Paying their rent. That's a big issue for a lot of people now. They can't go to work. A huge percentage of the workforce is not able to go back to work because they're in the service industries, they're in the restaurant industry and such. So that's a great example of how this has shifted. So moving forward, something to think about is if you were to pursue grant funds, is to think about those emerging needs. That's a huge word. And I'm telling you, it's a huge buzzword. Guaranteed the funders are gonna like it. What are the emerging needs that your population has? What are they struggling with? And what can you do to help them? And what can the funders' money and support help you do to help them, right? That is the name of the game now. If you want to be resilient moving forward, you want to get grant money for your programs, I'm telling you, this is how you have to do it. Think about those emerging needs and figure out what you can do, what programs you can do to serve those needs, and then, communicate that with your funders. So super awesome. So we have Eliana, I'm sorry, I'm a terrible reader. We serve pregnant and postpartum women. Our mothers are being affected by changing hospital policies, isolation, and increased postpartum depression. There you go. That's an emerging need. And I've actually, we had a family friend that went through something similar. She had her baby. It's a friend who's a nurse. She had a patient. She had the baby, and the mom tested positive for COVID, and the baby did not. So what they did was they kept the baby in the hospital and they sent mom home. Brand new mom, 23 years old. That was an extremely devastating situation for her, right? So there you go. That's an example. And thank you for sharing that. It's an example of an emerging need. Previously, you could explain, for example, exactly, sad but true, yep. You could explain, let's say you were doing a grant proposal for that. You could say that previously these were the rates of postpartum, and these are these are how many women are having babies. This is the rates of postpartum depression. Now, because of XYZ, there's an increase. So what can you do to help that, right? Is there maybe other policies you can advocate for? Is there maybe additional counseling or some kind of, you know what I'm saying, it's like counseling for these women that you could provide? Maybe there's some kind of other support that you can provide, right? So think about these type of things. Oh, beautiful. Started COVID-19 groups. Excellent, right? Perfect idea. So that is an emerging need, right? Your emerging need are these women are being disconnected from their babies or whatever the, the situation is. What are you doing? You're starting COVID-19 groups. So that's the emerging need that your community has. You also want to back it up with as much statistics as you can. Statistics are great when it comes to the grant writing world. And those are things you want to encourage the funders to understand, because funders, it's really interesting. Funders don't really know what's going on. They lean on the nonprofits to educate them, because you guys are the ones on the ground. You're the ones working with the people. You know what they need more than anybody else. So that's one way that you can advocate for your people, right? For whoever it is that you're serving, is letting them know about what's going on. And this is going to be the name of the game moving forward. Awesome. Does anybody else have any ideas that they want to share? Any emerging needs they found in their communities?
I'll just kind of go further as to the question I posed earlier, which was developing a concept. I've worked as an interim CEO and as a consultant for many not-for-profits. And in light of different things that have occurred over the past year, I think that one of the things that each not-for-profit, no matter what their initial cause or primary cause is, we can all learn a little bit about social engagement and respect and civic engagement as well.
Yes.
And what I'm trying to do is develop this concept further so that it can be applied as a standalone organization, but also be a resource for different not-for-profits or governments or other entities to come and be able to engage in training or coaching or different plans that will help the community in this way. So I guess what I'm saying is that developing the concept is one thing, and I'm basing it on several things. I'm basing it on the perspectives of the different community groups, different government groups, different law enforcement groups, and trying to ascertain what each of them is thinking and reflecting in the way they act as an organization or the individuals that represent them. So this is something that I will need funding for, and I'm trying to think of the best first steps to approach this.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you so much for sharing what you're doing. It makes perfect sense, right? Because I think you're so right. We're learning to embrace, the human interaction. We're learning to embrace the needs of connection, right? I mean, now more than ever, that is like blatantly in our face. If we didn't realize it was important before, now we really do. There's also a lot of studies,
Right.
a lot of psychology studies and healthcare studies, mental health studies on this.
Right.
So when it comes to what you're doing, I mean, definitely one of your options is the fiscal sponsorship route, which we'll talk about. Remind me if I forget. Is which is basically partnering with another nonprofit, and then from there you can try out. So you could try out your program like under their umbrella, like you had mentioned,
Right.
to see if it works. And definitely, and that can help you with the cultivating of the programming and getting it like on paper, and then from there you can start applying to different grants for it.
So maybe I could contact you offline.
Yep, right after we'll pop up the information about the fiscal sponsorship again.
Okay.
But I'll talk about it a little bit more at the end, just so if anybody else has any more questions about it, but it's definitely one of your best ways to go
Okay.
to get that started. So great stuff, great stuff.
Great, thank you.
Absolutely, thank you for sharing. So this is going good. So reevaluating your programs. The first question was, how has COVID affected the population we serve? Very important. And what are things you can do to help your population now and in the future? I feel like we also answered that question, right? Like we talked about the moms and the babies, like they have these wonderful COVID groups that they can communicate with each other, share with each other, right? There's different ways and different types of programs that are can be developed to meet these emerging needs. So how can you adapt your current programming to an online environment? That's also another thing to think about, is how do we do that, right? So how can we, let's say for instance, the COVID support groups, we can totally bring that into the online environment. Maybe you can have Zoom calls once a week, or maybe you can, do FaceTime phone calls or something like that. And we've seen a lot of this. Social media has been really great, I think, in sharing people's different ways that people are able to connect using the online environment. And that's something to keep in mind, because even though now we're seeing buildings opening up again, offices are opening, I think restaurants in most locations are open now. The fact is, now that this has happened once, it's going to be the go-to moving forward. I really believe firmly that the whole online environment is just going to increase. It's not going to decrease. So that's something that, you know, to think about as you're developing your programming is how can you embrace the online environment? Because funders also know this. So they are very likely to provide more. I would say, oh, can you return to the previous slide? I sure can. There is a typo though, so I apologize. Oh, wait. Hold on a second. Let me, give me 1 second. Sorry, I'm technologically not the savviest on this. And because I'm a nerd, I can't stand seeing typos. Okay. Oops. Wait. Sorry. Good thing we're ahead of time here. Let me go back over there. But yeah, so I think the online environment, and actually we've had a couple of organizations we work with that were doing door-to-door campaigns and door-to-door services. And one of the ways that they adapted with COVID was they started doing everything online. So they do different trainings and such online, which is, I think, great. Okay, so let's go back to that. This was a slide. Okay, so now, so reevaluating your programs. Here's the other slide. So again, these are some questions that you can ask yourself. These are some things you can think about, you know, when you're looking at your programs and you're looking at what the situation, right? Because you want to do a cross comparison of what situation are we in now? How is this going to move forward? You know, it's hard to tell when things are going to get back to normal, and even harder to say what normal is, right? Because things are going to change. So there's some things that you can do for some self-evaluation, evaluating your activities and your programs to see what you think is a good idea as far as moving forward. So forward moving steps. So what we really need to do is revisit our vision for social impact, because context needs to change, right? So ensure that your work remains relevant. These are some things that you can do as far as developing your programs and services moving forward, whether that's redeveloping what you've done in the past or developing new programs and services, right? Make sure that your work remains relevant. Really think about the new world that we live in. Is the work that you're doing still relevant in this world? You know, I use the example of sports programs, which I think is really sad. Sports are an amazing, amazing thing for kids to do. There are a lot of situations where sports programs aren't quite as active as they used to be. So maybe may not be, and not to hate on them by any means, but just as an example, maybe that's not quite as relevant as some other type of program that you know what I'm saying, could be put into place. So you want to think about that. Some of the shifts, if you do already have current programming, or if we're developing new programs, some of the things you want to think about is how are the programs and services going to be delivered? Again, if you can do what you do in the online environment, or at least have that as a second option, that's going to be a thing that's going to make your organization much more resilient. It's really, you know, if it's education, how can you educate people in the online environment? If it's providing services, how can you connect with them in the online environment? So how can your programs and services be delivered now, considering what happened with COVID versus before? Also, now is a good time to forge new partnerships and extend your reach and impact. Maybe you have a setup, or you have a program, or you have something that's working really well, and maybe you can then share that or work with an organization outside of the state, outside of the community, in a different area, and start to connect, because now people are much more open, as we mentioned earlier. They're much more open to connection and to working with one another than they were in the past. Also, reframing the value of your work in the current context, why your mission matters now. This is a really, really good point. So if you've already done grants before, if you've already applied to grants before, now is the time to revise everything you've written and really think about your mission and how does your mission matter now in today's new world, because we're in a very different world today than we were this time last year. So as you're developing your narrative, as you're sharing your programs and services with funders, you need to think about how is it that your mission matters in our current world, and speak to that and write to that, because that's going to be at the top of mind of every funder. So resilient nonprofits post-COVID. This is an example of a nonprofit that has done very well. They're called the Bread for the City. So they provide food, medical, legal, and social services in Washington, D.C. But after the whole COVID situation, what they did was they had to close their food pantries to the public, which was really devastating for the community. But what they did instead was they started working with new partners to get groceries to constituents. So instead of having the food pantry open, they were able to set up a delivery service to actually bring food to the people who needed it most, right? In order to abide by the social distancing rules. They also were able to expand their medical service to include telehealth. So, you know, video calls with the physicians as well as COVID testing. So I'm going to ask the group, thinking through how they did this, what are some of the pros to the situation? What do you think is good about changing their services? Any ideas?
They easily adapted their programming to still serve their constituents, forging partnerships, but
Yep.
they still providing what they were offering before is the biggest thing.
Yep, exactly. Great answer. They're still able to serve the people that need it, just in a very different way, right? You know, they're not able to have the food pantry open. People can come to them, but they figured out how to go to the people that need it. So I think that's a really beautiful thing, right? They were still able to serve their people, but in a different way. Meeting the people where they are, exactly. Yep, that's exactly right. Meeting them where they are. And I think that's a great, making new connections, absolutely. And I think those are great. That should be kind of like the theme, right? Meet people where they are. At this point, we have to maybe go to people. We have to figure out where they are. How can we access them and think outside the box, right? So I think those are awesome examples of how this program was resilient, and they're still open. So they're not doing exactly what they were doing before, but they still are meeting their outcomes and objectives just as they were before. So we have adapted our servicing issues and created a virtual platform. Excellent. However, COVID is making it more difficult for new organizations like us with none or limited revenue. What do you suggest? So I would suggest partnering with another organization is probably going to be the top of mind idea. Remind me a little bit later when we're done, because we're almost done with the presentation, if you are a 501c3 already, or if you're like a fiscally sponsored organization, because that's also another option that's available to you. But what I would say is that it's difficult now, but there's different ways to engage foundations. Because what I'm finding too, which is really interesting, is if you have a newer nonprofit, but it is hyper-focused on the emerging needs, remember that term we talked about earlier, the emerging needs of people, some foundations are willing to give funding to you, versus before COVID, you would have to be in business for like 3 years. So there's still some ways and a little bit of wiggle room and some flexibility that exists now that didn't before. So that's awesome. Good questions. All right, let's go back to the presentation. So some of the cons to this situation, to me, there's not a lot of cons. The one con that I would say is that it's just, changing programs and changing structures and revamping everything takes a lot of work and energy. It sucks. It's hard to do, right? But the reality is it's the best way to continue to serve your people, to serve your mission. So I think it's, the pros definitely outweigh the cons. So moving forward, here's some suggestions that I have for you. Number one is having meaningful conversations. What I mean by this is talking to people, in classes like this one. If there's funders you want to engage with, have meaningful conversations and learn and share about what's going on with those that you serve. You're the ones that are directly working with people or with individuals or with animals or environment, whatever it may be. You're working on the ground, right? You're working with people, you know what the needs are. And it's really a great time to have these meaningful conversations and say, hey, did you know that these moms are being separated from their babies? I mean, who would know that, right? Unless somebody shared that information. And I think now is really a great time to have these meaningful conversations so we can come up with ideas. Start doing some internal evaluations. Look at your programs like we mentioned earlier. Look at the way that you're serving people and figure out new and different ways to, like someone mentioned, meet them where they are. How can you still serve individuals? How can you still serve your population, whatever it may be, in a different way? So that's part of the whole internal evaluation method. Also, be innovative and be collaborative. Now's the time to work together. Now's the time to collaborate. Now's the time to be innovative, and that, we have to start inventing.
Hi, Metris, how are you?
So that's going to be really important. Also, thinking outside the box.
Okay,
right?
well, I'm on a webinar right now, but
Can we mute ourselves, please?
But where are you going to be around 3:45?
Let's see what it is. Okay, there we go. So thinking outside of the box, right? We need to think about new and creative ways. Let me see who that is so we can mute them.
Okay, great. That sounds good. I'll call you then. Usually I'm looking.
So already hear the other person too. So we can.
So,
There we go. Okay, got her muted. Perfect. So let's go back to this. Sorry about that. So, okay, so thinking outside the box, what are new and creative ways that you can still meet people where they are? I love that term. I'm going to use that from here forward and really still provide for the needs of your community, of your service population, but in a different way, right? How can you do that? And also now is really the time to start strategizing for the future, because the future is, while it is kind of unknown, we don't know exactly what's going to happen. It is a good time for us to start strategizing for, okay, what can we do? How can we reshape our programs? How is our mission relevant in today's world? What can we do to be innovative and still meet the needs of these individuals, to meet the needs of the environment? I mean, the environment has a huge change, right? Like all of this that's going on affects the environment, it affects everything. So what can we do to start to strategize and create paths for productivity? How can we create solutions? How can we move forward through this? I'm a huge proponent in my work life and in my personal life on, this is the situation, let's move forward. How can we move forward? Like, I think it's so important. And now is a really great time to do that. And again, start working ahead. You know, if you want to start seeking out grant funds, start now. Don't wait until the last minute, because there may be a grant fund that's open today and you figure, okay, I can just wait till next month to apply, and the next month something happens and you're no longer eligible. So start thinking ahead, work proactively. I think it's super, super important. So that's the end of the presentation. I will unshare myself, and so we could talk a little bit more about all this. We have a question. Oh, I think we already answered that one. Okay. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
I just had a question about sending out letters of inquiries and starting new relationships with funders.
Yes.
You know, I think it's common to kind of call and say, hey, this is our programming. Are you guys interested? Can I send you a letter of inquiry?
Yes.
And then start building a relationship that way. Has that changed at all? I mean, are folks still answering phones and you know, like, how do you kind of start building those relationships, like, in the current situation?
Awesome question. So I'm actually going to give some templates the next workshop that we're doing. We started building out templates on how to do this, but definitely now more than ever, you have to take like 3 steps back and start to contact foundations more so than before. So before, you could kind of send an LOI and say, you know, LOI is a letter of intent, basically introducing yourself. Hi, I'm this nonprofit. This is what I'm doing. This is the funding that I need, right? So now we have to take a few steps back. And what we need to do is contact them. You could do by email is really good, or you could send a letter. We have an organization now that we ended up doing 5 letters, and we sent 5 letters, and we did not ask them for any money. All we said is, this is what we do. We know this is what you do. We feel that, you know, we collaborate with you. Is this still what your initiatives are? Is this still what your focus is? Would you be open to a conversation about networking and working together? So asking permission and being extremely respectful of just as much turmoil as we are in, the foundations are as well. And it saves a lot of time and energy to just send either an email, like I said, or a letter, and not asking for money, not asking for funding, just saying, we recognize this is what we do. We recognize what you do based on your website or whatever it is. How do you feel that there's an opportunity for us to partner moving forward? So that's going to be kind of like your initial communication piece. And what I recommend we've been doing is we'll send letters first, and 2 weeks later, we'll follow up with a phone call or an email. I like to have a paper trail personally. So like, I like to do a letter first, 2 weeks later, send an email, and then 2 weeks later, make a phone call. And if you can't get through them after the 3rd time, then maybe wait like 3 months and then try it again. So that's kind of
a letter first.
Yep, a letter first, but like a very general, hey, I would love to partner with you. This is what I'm doing, this is what you're doing. You know, do you think we could work together? Very, no money, no asking of anything aside from, we just want to know if we're still on the same page. Because a lot of them have not updated their websites, so the funding initiatives we're seeing on their websites are not accurate. The reason being is they don't know what they're doing either, because remember, we talked about the crisis, we talked about the emerging needs and the long-term. We're still not yet at that long-term. They don't know what their long-term initiatives are, you know, because everything is still up in arms, right? So because of that, now until that happens, which may be a year from now, this may not happen anytime soon, right? You have to kind of like approach them, I would say, no more than every 3 months. And in the next workshop, like, I have a whole timeline about this that I'm still developing. But the idea is you do a letter, an introduction letter, just introducing who you are and asking if you can have a conversation with them. You follow up 2 weeks later by an email and say, hey, I sent this letter, blah, blah, blah. And then you'll follow up by a phone call 2 weeks later. if after that 6-week term you don't hear from them, you leave them alone for at least 3 months. And then you start again because their initiatives may have changed. And don't bother them too much. Only do 3 times. But yeah, that's the plan. And the thing is, it kind of sucks because we're having to do this in 3-month periods, but it's the only way to do it until they're able to reestablish what those long-term initiatives are, which I don't think is going to happen for another year. 6 months to a year. Yep. So good question. Good question. I hope that helps. Any other questions? Any other thoughts? Feel free to pick my brain for a couple minutes. We're doing good on time. Nothing. Okay, yes. Hey, Stacy.
Hey. So I work mostly with education and a lot of in-person volunteer events, which have been obviously put to a complete halt
Yes.
in recent times, but slowly being able to open up if they're outdoors. I guess I'm just wondering your suggestions on being able to start that transition again to in-person volunteer opportunities for K through 12, 12th grade students, like, not quite college, not, generally under the age of 18.
Right. So I've seen, I'll give you some examples of what I've seen. And this was for college students, so it might have to be adapted a little bit. But like the Huizenga College of Business I think it's in Fort Lauderdale. What they did was they have like a requirement of volunteerism, and they have to actually go out and physically do programs. They're not able to do it. So what they've done instead is that they've connected with nonprofits in the virtual world, and they're providing them services that way. So what I would say is when it comes to the kids is what were they doing before? What were some of the activities? And how can those activities somehow be altered for the virtual world, or maybe in smaller groups, right? So think about, and I would say, because the thing is it gets super overwhelming so quickly, just think about what those activities are. And if those activities can't be done, think higher level. What is the purpose of those activities? Like, let's say it was recycling, right? The purpose of recycling, what is the purpose of recycling? Because people trash the earth, and we need to teach these kids that we need to clean it, right? So maybe they can't actually do large groups of recycling efforts, but maybe they can create something, a piece of art, like a little pamphlet or something. Maybe an art teacher can get involved, and they can instead send this to neighbors and say, hey, we're not, because of social distancing, blah, blah, we're not able to pick up the trash, but how about you do it? Let's, you know what I'm saying? Encourage people to do things like that. So there's plenty of ways, that just came off the top of my head, there's plenty of ways to think of it, right? Of how they can still accomplish their purpose, but in this new world. So I would think of something like that. I actually really like that idea, the recycling idea. That was pretty good, right?
Okay.
Right. Yeah, so think about that. Think about things like that. And again, I think it's really good to just in the funders that I've communicated with, they like to see resilient organizations coming up with new ideas like this. So even if you do get back to in-person volunteering, which I think is amazing, it's good to have a secondary plan or incorporate a little bit of both, so that they see that if for some reason, hopefully this never happens again, but if it does, you have another way to keep moving forward.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Oh, got it. Thank you, Eliana, I'm sorry, I keep botching your name. Such a pretty name. Awesome. Yep.
A follow-up on Stacy's question. Have you seen in organizations that you've worked with, it's kind of like that maintaining, so say you do have a big volunteer base or folks that come out to your events, have you seen folks doing kind of like virtual events just to kind of like maintain that community, like, and have done that successfully? Is that something like that you think should be encouraged, or, just kind of, make folks, even talk about, hey, join in and see how we're transitioning or whatever, just to kind of keep folks on,
Yep, I think so. I have seen it quite a bit. And what I've seen is, if it's not like a fundraising event online, what I've seen a lot actually is organizations that will have like an open call for questions and answers, or open conversations about things. They're kind of taking a few steps back. And for instance, like ocean, right? Like we're talking about ocean preservation, right? So maybe you want to go online and just educate people, because it's interesting that we think people know about everything that we know, but they really don't. You know what I'm saying? It's like me with the grant stuff. I can be sleeping and I can talk about this all day long, but that doesn't mean anybody else does, right? So it's a really cool opportunity because people are online and they are in a place of wanting to learn, to just start having, even if it's just chats about things. Like, did you know that, you know, this is, you know, volunteerism from K through 12 has all these positive benefits in the community, in the lives of the kids, in the lives of the educators. Did you know the ocean relief, this is the issue. We don't have good fish in Florida, which is, right, is really important. Like, people don't know these things, right? So like, so I think having online events that are a little bit outside of the box is going to be really important. So it may not be traditional, you know, you may not have a fundraising event online. I mean, which you could, you know what I'm saying? I'm sure you could have one, but think about like educating people, having open conversations, talking about things. I've seen some nonprofits that have been able to engage, you know, people like the mayor or whoever, somebody like that from the government, or even famous people to come online and talk or sing or do something. And you know what I'm saying? There's a lot of different engagements, because the thing is, since we don't have to deal with travel, you're able to do it all online. It's just a matter of popping up a link. So I would say definitely you still want to become relevant. YouTube channels, I've seen organizations that have started YouTube channels. They're using a lot of Instagram and social media, you know, to share thoughts and opinions and perspectives and how this is affecting their industry. So I think now is the time for that. And that helps keep you top of mind, because right now the name of the game, besides the whole emerging needs, really is social media. That's how everybody's connecting. I mean, they were before, but now even more so. You know what I'm saying? So really using that just to share your expertise, to share what it is you know. Something you may feel is super basic for somebody else is brand new information. So, you know, have that voice and be willing to share it. Good stuff, good stuff. Well, I'm going to be here for a few more minutes if anybody has any more questions. Oh, we talked about fiscal sponsorship. Does anybody have any more questions regarding fiscal sponsorship at all? Very briefly, like Sarah said, Luli's the one that you want to contact, Luli at forsocialchange.org. I work with them very closely on that program. It's a great way if you have a project that's not quite a 501c3 yet, but you want to kind of test it out and use the history of the center, you could do so in order for you to acquire grants. So yeah, definitely something to look into. There's on their website, on the forsocialchange.org, there's a page there, a link for fiscal sponsorship, and it has a ton of information, a video on it. There's really well done, so you can read into it a little bit more if you're interested.
Awesome. And they can take care of a lot of the administrative overhead associated with nonprofits, which would be, I think, super helpful to a lot of folks who.
Absolutely.
Does that include like trademarking logos and, you know, having like documentation looked over to make sure it's like covering everything legally and that sort of services, or is that not included?
So they do, the fiscal management is more helping you with the financial side and the structure side of it. They do have, I know they connect with different individuals to do different parts of that, but like your trademark and all that would have to go through an attorney. They work with SCORE Miami-Dade really closely, so they can help you like with your business plan and your structuring and all that stuff. But I just put my email here in the chat. There's a couple, depending on what you're looking for, there's a couple of other organizations that are local that do that, and specifically work with nonprofits. There's an accounting firm that works with them, like if you need more extended accounting. There's an attorney that I know of that works with them. So I can send you some names of some people.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Yeah. So send me an email though, because I'll forget.
No worries.
We actually have a Ask a Lawyer Day, and I think it might just be for members. I'm not sure, but it's like 15 minutes with this lawyer who focuses on nonprofit stuff. But I think one of the fiscal management options, they do look over grants you're going to send out and stuff like that. Yeah. So there is that level of, and they'll even manage, that's one good thing. If you get a big grant, they'll manage it for you and they'll do some of the reporting. I think most of the reporting and stuff like that, which can get pretty detailed and time heavy depending on the size of your organization. So it can be, I think, a great option for some folks. Awesome. And I'm going to put down Luli in the chat. Her email, she is the fiscal management lady at the center, and she also does financial stuff too. So.
She is awesome. Her and I work very closely together. She knows everything there is to know about that stuff. So you're in
And
good hands.
Linda, maybe you can tell them about the next few workshops because we're kind of doing like a series this
Yes.
fall.
Yes. So we have, I believe the next one is the budgeting workshop that's coming up the 20 something of October, 27th, I think it is, or 26th. I'll double check the
29th.
29th of October. So that's a workshop that's actually in collaboration with myself and Luli, who Sarah just mentioned is the financial manager at the Center for Social Change. And what we're going to go through in that workshop is going to be how to do a program budget for grants specifically, because there is so much to it. And a budget really is its own document, separate and apart from your narrative that you're writing in a grant proposal. So that's going to be a really cool workshop. Later on in the year, I think it's in November, we're doing another one that's going to be strategy. So I'm going to give you some timelines and outlines on how to approach funders and what to do moving forward. Like we mentioned, every 3 months communicating with them and such. And so those are going to be, I think those are the three, right? Those are three that we have in total that's going to kind of go over how to plan and how to navigate all this moving forward, because it's so interesting. I've always been really big on strategizing because we want to see the nonprofits grow. We want to see them increase funding. We want to see them have more impact, right? To do that, though, there has to be ongoing activities, grant writing, research, and all these things. But now with COVID, it's shifted on how to do that. So instead of looking at things for a year, you're kind of looking at it in quarters. Like every 3 months, you have to have a new approach. So the idea is to give you information based on research reports that have come out, studies that are being done, etc., and give you information on how you can start moving forward, going forward. So. Because the thing is, and I didn't go into this too much because I don't want to take up too much time. There's more grant funds now than there was this time last year. The grant funding is not going down. That's a question I get all the time. Like, oh, there's no grant funds. It's not true. There's more money now. Before we were looking at around $500 billion. Now we're looking at almost $1 trillion in grant funds available. This year alone, there's been over $200 or $300 million, whatever, that have increased in the federal level. There's a lot of new funding coming out. So it's quite the contrary. It's just a matter of how you approach it.
And
yes.
That being said, next Thursday, we're having a free workshop too. You can find the link on our Facebook or on Eventbrite. I think it's called Navigating the New Funding Landscape. And we're going to have someone from Foundation Search give a short overview of how they just did a report interviewing different nonprofits and kind of giving an overview of how foundations have changed, but they still have a lot of money to give out. So he's going to talk a little bit about that and kind of, and that one's a free workshop at 2 p.m. as well. So
it's fabulous. That's going to be really good. Yeah, because the foundations have to give, like Sarah and I were talking earlier, they have to legally give, it's a minimum of 5% of their income in grants. They have to give the money. That hasn't changed related to COVID in any way, shape, or form. And in some situations, depending on how they're receiving funding, that 5% has gone up. So what they had 5% last year, 5% this year is different because of stock markets and all that kind of stuff. So there's plenty of money available. Plenty of money available. It's just a matter of how to apply, how to approach it, what to look for, and how to communicate what you need the money for. So.
Yeah, and I think the one in November will be really nice because it'll kind of help us plan for the next year.
Yes.
And we're also going to have a accounting workshop. We had one in April with a woman kind of talking about kind of the language of accounting and kind of managing, like coming from the budget, but from a very practical side of if you use QuickBooks Online, like how to run certain reports, that certain funders want, and kind of getting set up in there the right way initially can make that fairly easy once you know how. So she's gonna go over that a little bit too. I think that's early December too. So
excellent. There's some great workshops coming up. I plan on attending them all myself. Good stuff.
And the last thing, I will be emailing all of you guys a link to a survey. If you could fill it out, that'd be really helpful so we know what kind of stuff to offer in the future. And I'll also send you a link to see this webinar for the next couple of days in case you want to go back and look at anything. So thanks for coming. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks everybody for being here.
Thank you.
Let's just put that there.